Today I'm going to go through action potentials. Okay, let's get started. So an action potential is the same in every single time an actual potential occurs. It is the same. It's identical. The only way a signal differs is in its frequency, how frequent that action potentials are occurring, right? But let me just get into the basics of what an action potential is. Okay, so we've got the extracellular, intracellular. Okay, and generally, your intracellular has a negative membrane potential. Okay, it has a negative membrane potential, as you can see here, the negative 70 millivolts. What happens is the first step is the negative. Okay, I just want to make reference to negative 55 millivolts. If the action potential doesn't get past this threshold or to this threshold, an action potential will not occur. There's no partial action potentials or anything like that. Okay, so what happens is during this phase, right, is called depolarization. Depolarization. Why is it depolarization? We're going more positively charged. Okay, so and polarization is the difference in charge. It's more approaching zero, and it will eventually get to a positive charge. And what's happening is sodium channels opened, and sodium is rushing into the cell. Okay, sodium is rushing into the cell, and then eventually, at the top, right, roughly about here, sodium channels close. Okay, sodium channels close, and then this point here where we go down, it's called repolarization. We're going back to a difference in charge, the negative membrane potential. And what's happening is, this is repolarization is when potassium channels, have opened, and potassium is rushing outside the cell. Okay? That's number 2. Okay? And then what happens is we go below, but what happens is we keep on repolarizing where potassium is leaving the cell. However, we get to a point where we're actually below the original membrane potential, negative membrane potential, we're below it. So this is called hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization. Okay? And this is also known as the refractory period. The reason why it's called the refractory period is because during this time, another action potential cannot be initiated. The reason is why? Remember what happens. What starts the initial action potential? What starts the action potential? The sodium channels. Sodium channels are closed, right? In this point, sodium channels are closed. So another action potential cannot be stimulated. Okay? That's why it's called the refractory period. Okay? But this is hyperpolarization. And then what happens is, during this time, to get back to the original membrane potential, so up to this point, what's happened here is potassium channels have closed. Potassium channels have closed, okay? And then what happens is, inside the cell, if you remember, there's the sodium-potassium pump. And the sodium-potassium pump brings 3 sodium outside the cell and 2 potassium in. So that's net negative, right? Potential. Because we're taking out 3 sodium, 3 positively charged ions, bringing in 2, so overall we're net negative 1. So in order to get back to that original negative membrane potential, the sodium-potassium pump will help us get back to the negative 70 millivolts. Okay. Now I'm going to go into what happens in a neuron level, right? So at this point, you've got the axon helix. The axon helix is where the action potential starts from. Now remember, in your action potential, all these areas, it's negative. Negative membrane potential. Remember, negative 70 millivolts. Break this up into sections. What's going to happen? Okay. So what's going to happen is we're going to have depolarization, where it becomes more positively charged when sodium channels open. And when sodium channels open, what happens? This will become more positively charged. Okay? And it will cause the neighboring area to be more positively charged. So it's like a chain reaction here. Okay? But when this becomes depolarized and starts depolarizing, this will enter the refractory period. So this will be repolarizing. So when one area along the axon, let's say the action potential is jumping, one area will be repolarizing, will be in the repolarization phase, one will be in the depolarization phase. And it continues from there. So that's how we propagate. This is called propagation. This is how we propagate the action potential. Okay. So one will be depolarizing, the other will be repolarizing, and it'll move along. So the next one, this will cause depolarization in the next area. This will become polarized. This would be depolarized. And what would happen is this area would then also enter the refractory period, or it's going to be repolarized. It's going to be being repolarized in this stage, right? It's going to try to get back to the negative membrane potential. So during this stage, these areas of the axon, because they're in the refractory period, right, where sodium channels are closed, another action potential cannot be stimulated in these areas. But it continues going down and down the axon until it triggers the something at the axon terminal or a synapse, right? This could be neurotransmitters getting released. But that's what happens with an action potential.